Chapter 2 of A Voyage in the Sunbeam by Anna Brassey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Dovey Cross, Taos, New Mexico. Madeira, Tenerife, and Cape de Verde Islands. Full many a green isle needs must be In this wide sea of misery, Or the mariner worn and wan Never thus could voyage on. Sunday, July 16th. Porto Santo being visible on the port bow, a quarter of a mile ahead, by 3:55 a.m. this morning, our three navigators congratulated themselves and each other on the good landfall they had made. It looks a curious little island, and is situated about 35 miles northeast of Madeira, with a high peak in the centre of which we could only see the extreme point appearing above the clouds. It is interesting to know that it was from his observation of the driftwood and debris washed on to the eastern shore that Columbus, who had married the daughter of the governor of Porto Santo, derived his first impressions of the existence of the New World. Here it was that he first realized there might possibly be a large and unknown country to the westward. Here it was that he first conceived the project of exploring the hitherto unknown ocean, and of discovering what new countries might bound its western shores. An hour later we saw Fora and its light, at the extreme east of Madeira, and could soon distinguish the mountains in the centre of the latter island. As we rapidly approached the land, the beauty of the scenery became more fully apparent. A mass of dark purple volcanic rocks, clothed on the top with the richest vegetation, with patches of all sorts of colour on their sides, rises boldly from the sea. There are several small detached rocks, and one curious pointed little island, with an arch right through the middle of it, rather like the Perce Rock on the coast of Nova Scotia. We steamed slowly along the east coast, passing many pretty hamlets, nestled in bays or perched on the side of hills, and observing how every possible nook and corner seemed to be terraced and cultivated. Sugar canes, Indian corn, vines, and many varieties of tropical and semi-tropical plants grow luxuriantly in this lovely climate. Nearly all the cottages in the island are inhabited by a simple people, many of whom have never left their native villages, even to look at the magnificent view from the top of the surrounding mountains, or to gaze on the sea by which they are encompassed. We dropped our anchor in the Bay of Funchal at about 12 o'clock, and before breakfast was over found ourselves surrounded by a perfect flotilla of boats, though none of them dared approach very near, until the health officer had come alongside and pronounced us free from infection. At this moment all are complaining much of the heat, which since yesterday has been very great, and is caused by the wind called Est, blowing direct from the African deserts. It was 79 degrees in the coolest place on board, and 84 degrees on shore in the shade, in the middle of the day. The African mail steamer Ethiopia, last from Bonny, west coast of Africa, whence she arrived the day before yesterday, was lying in the bay, and the children went on board with some of our party to see her cargo of monkeys, parrots, and pineapples. The result was an importation of 5 parrots on board the Sunbeam, but the monkeys were too big for us. Captain Dane, who paid us a return visit, said that the temperature here appeared quite cool to him, as for the last few weeks his thermometer had varied from 82 degrees to 96 degrees in the shade. We had service at 4 p.m., and at 5 p.m. went ashore in a native boat, furnished with bilge pieces, to keep her straight when beached, and to avoid the surf, for it was too rough for our own boats. At the water's edge a curious sort of double sleigh, drawn by 2 oxen, was waiting. Into this we stepped, setting off with considerable rapidity up the steep shingly beach under a beautiful row of trees to the Praca, where the greater portion of the population were walking up and down, or sitting under the shade of the magnolias. These plants here attain the size of forest trees, and their large white wax-like flowers shed a most delightful fragrance on the evening air. There were graceful pepper vines, too, and a great variety of trees only known to us in England in the form of small shrubs. This being a festival day, the streets were crowded with people from town and country, in their holiday attire. The doorposts and balconies of the houses were wreathed with flowers, the designs in many cases being very pretty. One arcade in particular was quite lovely, with arches made of double red geranium, mixed with the feathery-looking pepper leaves, while the uprights were covered with amaryllis and white arum lilies. The streets were strewn with roses and branches of myrtle, which, bruised by the feet of the passers-by and the runners of the bullock sleigh, emitted a delicious aromatic odour. The trellises in the gardens seem overgrown with stephanotis, mauve and purple passion flowers, and all kinds of rare creepers. The purple and white hibiscus shoots up some 14 to 16 feet in height. Bananas, full of fruit and flower, strelitzias, heliotrope, geraniums, and pelargoniums bloom all around in large shrubs, mixed with palms and mimosas of every variety, and the whole formed such an enchanting picture that we were loath to tear ourselves away. A ride of about 20 minutes in the bullock sleigh up a steep hill by the side of a rocky torrent, whose banks were overgrown with caladiums and vines, brought us to our destination, Till, whence we had a splendid view of the town and bay stretching beneath us. During the ascent we passed several cottages, whose inhabitants stood airing themselves on the threshold after the great heat of the day, and through the open doorways we occasionally got a peep into the gardens beyond, full of bright flowers and luxuriant with vines, fig trees, and bananas. As we sat in the terrace garden at Till, we enjoyed the sweet scent of the flowers we could no longer see, and listened to the cool splash of water in the fountain below, whilst Allnutt, with unceasing energy, searched amongst the bushes for moths, of which he found a large number. We jogged down the hill a great deal faster than we had come up, stopping only for a short time in the now more than ever crowded Praça to listen to one or two airs played by the Portuguese band, before we got back to the yacht at about 10:30. Next morning we were off to the fish market by 7 o'clock, but it was not a good time for our visit, as there had been no moon on the previous night, and, though there were fish of various kinds, saw nothing specially worth of notice. The picturesque costumes of the people were, however, interesting. We afterwards went to the fruit market, though it was not specially worth seeing, for most of the fruit and vegetables are brought in boats from villages on the seashore, and, as it is necessary to wait until the sea breeze springs up, they do not arrive until midday. After our walk the children and I went down to the beach and bathed, taking care not to go too far out on account of the sharks, of which we had been warned. We undressed and dressed in tents, not unlike clothes horses, with a bit of matting thrown over them, in which the heat was intense. The beach is very steep, and as one gets out of one's depth immediately, indifferent swimmers put on a couple of bladders, which stick out behind their backs and produce a strange effect, or else take a bathing man into the water with them. I preferred the latter course, and we all had a pleasant bathe. The natives seem almost amphibious in their habits, and the yacht is surrounded all day by boats full of small boys, who will dive to any depth for sixpence, a dozen of them spluttering and fighting for the coin in the water at the same time. They will go down on one side of the yacht, too, and bob up on the other, almost before you have time to run across the deck to witness their reappearance. The Loo Rock, with its old fortress, close to our anchorage, forms a picturesque object, and the scene from the yacht, enlivened by the presence of numerous market boats laden with fruit and vegetables, is very pretty. We lie about 150 yards from the shore, just under Mr. Dinera's quinta. The cliff just here is overhung with bougainvilleas, geraniums, fuchsias, aloes, prickly pears, and other flowers, which grow luxuriantly quite down to the water's edge, wherever they can contrive to find a root hold. After 5 o'clock tea we rode up the mount and through the woods on horseback, along a road gay with masses of wild geranium, hydrangea, amaryllis, and fuchsia. We dismounted at a lovely place which contains a large number of rare trees and plants, brought from all parts of the world. Here were enormous camellias, as well as purple, red, and white azaleas, Guernsey lilies, all growing in the greatest profusion. Our descent of the mount, by means of a form of conveyance commonly used on the island, was very amusing. At the summit we found basket-work sleighs, each constructed to hold 2 people, and attended by a couple of men lashed together. Into these we stepped, and were immediately pushed down the hill at a tremendous pace. The gliding motion is delightful, and was altogether a novelty to us. The men managed the sleighs with great skill, steering them in the most wonderful manner round the sharp angles in the zigzag road, and making use of their bare feet as brakes when necessary. The turns were occasionally so abrupt that it seemed almost impossible that we could avoid being upset, but we reached the bottom quite safely. The children were especially delighted with the trip, and indeed we all enjoyed it immensely. The only danger is the risk of fire from the friction of the steel runners against the gravel road. After paying a visit to Mr. and Mrs. Blandy, whose house is beautifully situated, we dined at the hotel, and afterwards sat in the lovely semi-tropical garden until it was time to go on board to bed. Tuesday, July 18th. We were called at 4:30 a.m. and went ashore soon after 6 to meet some friends, with whom we had arranged to ride up to the Grand Corral and to breakfast there 5,000 feet above the level of the sea. It soon became evident that the time we had selected for landing was the fashionable bathing hour. In fact, it required some skill on our part to keep the boat clear of the crowds of people of both sexes and all ages who were taking their morning dip. It was most absurd to see entire families, from the bald-headed and spectacled grandfather to the baby who could scarcely walk, all disporting themselves in the water together, many of them supported by the very inelegant-looking bladders I have mentioned. There was a little delay in mounting our horses under the shade of the fig trees, but when we were once off, a party of 11, the cavalcade became quite formidable. As we clattered up the paved streets, between vineyard and garden walls, curiosity opened her lattice on more than one occasion, to ascertain the cause of the unwonted commotion. The views on our way, as we sometimes climbed a steep ascent or descended a deep ravine, were very varied, but always beautiful. About half-way up, we stopped to rest under a delightful trellis of vines, by the side of a rushing mountain stream bordered with ferns. Then, leaving the vineyards and gardens behind us, we passed through forests of shady Spanish chestnut trees, beneath which stretched the luxurious greensward. At 10 o'clock we quitted this grateful shade, and arrived at the neck of the pass, facing the Grand Corral, where we had to make our choice of ascending a conical hill on our left or the Torrinhas Peak on our right. The latter was chosen as promising the better view, although it was rather farther off, so we were accordingly seized upon by some of the crowd of peasants who surrounded us, and who at once proceeded to push and pull us up a steep, slippery grass slope, interspersed with large boulders. The view from the top, looking down a sheer precipice of some 1,500 feet in depth into the valley below, was lovely. Quite at the bottom, amid the numerous ravines and small spurs of rocks by which the valley is intersected, we could distinguish some small patches of cultivated ground. Above our heads towered the jagged crests of the highest peaks, Pico Ruvo and others, which we had already seen from the yacht when we first sighted the island. A pleasant walk over some grassy slopes and 2 more hard scrambles took us to the summit of the Torrinhas Peak, but the charming and extensive view toward Camara de Lobos and the bay and town of Funchal was an ample reward for all our trouble. It did not take us long to get back to the welcome shade of the chestnut trees, for we were all ravenously hungry, it being now 11 o'clock. But alas! breakfast had not arrived, so we had no resource but to mount our horses again and ride down to meet it. Mr. Miles of the hotel had not kept his word. He had promised that our provisions should be sent up to us by 9 o'clock, and it was midday before we met the men carrying the hampers on their heads. There was now nothing for it but to organize a picnic on the terrace of Mr. Vake's deserted villa, beneath the shade of camellia, fuchsia, myrtle, magnolia, and pepper trees, from whence we could also enjoy the fine view of the fertile valley beneath us and the blue sea sparkling beyond. Wednesday, July 19th. We were so tired after our exertions of yesterday that it was 9 o'clock before we all mustered for our morning swim, which I think we enjoyed the more from the fact of our having previously been prevented by the sharks, or rather by the rumour of sharks. We were engaged to lunch at Mr. and Mrs. Blandy's, but I was so weary that I did not go ashore until about 6 o'clock in the evening, and then I went first to the English cemetery, which is very prettily laid out and well kept. The various paths are shaded by pepper trees entwined with bougainvillea, while in many places the railings are completely covered by long trailing masses of stephanotis in full bloom. Some of the inscriptions on the tombs are extremely touching, and it is sad to see, as is almost always the case in places much resorted to by invalids, how large a proportion of those who lie buried here have been cut off in the very flower of their youth. Indeed, the residents at Madeira complain that it is a melancholy drawback to the charms of this beautiful island, that the friendship frequently formed between them and people who come hither in search of health is in so many cases brought to an early and sad termination. Having seen and admired Mrs. Foljambe's charming garden by daylight, we returned on board to receive some friends. Unfortunately, they were not very good sailors, and out of our party of 20, one lady had to go ashore at once, and another before dinner was over. They all admired the yacht very much, particularly the various cosy corners in the deck house. It was a lovely night, and after the departure of our guests at about 10 o'clock, we steamed out of the bay, where we found a nice light breeze, which enabled us to sail. Thursday, July 20th. All to-day has been taken up in arranging our photographs, journals, etc., etc., and in preparing for our visit to Tenerife. About 12 o'clock the wind fell light, and we tried fishing, but without success, though several bonitos, or flying fish, were seen. It was very hot, and it seemed quite a relief when, at 8 o'clock in the evening, we began steaming, thus creating a breeze for ourselves. Friday, July 21st. We all rose early, and were full of excitement to catch the first glimpse of the famous Peak of Tenerife. There was a nice breeze from the northeast, the true trade wind, we hope, which ought to carry us down nearly to the line. The morning being rather hazy, it was quite 10 o'clock before we saw the Peak, towering above the clouds, right ahead, about 59 miles off. As we approached, it appeared less perpendicular than we had expected, or than it is generally represented in pictures. The other mountains, too, in the centre of the island, from the midst of which it rises, are so very lofty that, in spite of its conical sugar-loaf top, it is difficult at first to realize that the Peak is 12,180 feet high. We dropped anchor under its shadow in the harbour of Orotava, in preference to the capital, Santa Cruz, both on account of its being a healthier place, and also in order to be nearer to the Peak, which we wished to ascend. The heat having made the rest of our party rather lazy, Captain Lecky and I volunteered to go on shore to see the Vice Consul, Mr. Goodall, and try to make arrangements for our expedition. It was only 2 p.m., and very hot work, walking through the deserted streets, but luckily we had not far to go, and the house was nice and cool when we got there. Mr. Goodall sent off at once for a carriage, despatching a messenger also to the mountains for horses and guides, which there was some difficulty in obtaining at such short notice. Having organized the expedition, we re-embarked to dine on board the yacht, and I went to bed at 7, to be called again, however, at 10:30 o'clock. After a light supper, we landed and went to the Vice Consul's, arriving there exactly at midnight. But no horses were forthcoming, so we lay down on our rugs in the patio, and endeavoured to sleep, as we knew we should require all our strength for the expedition before us. There were sundry false alarms of a start, as the horses arrived by ones and twos from the neighbouring villages, accompanied by their respective owners. By 2 o'clock all our steeds, 12 in number, had assembled, and in another quarter of an hour we were leaving the town by a steep stony path bordered by low walls. There was no moon, and for the first 2 hours it was very dark. At the end of that time we could see the first glimmer of dawn, and were shortly afterwards able to distinguish each other, and to observe the beautiful view which lay below us as we wended our way up and up between small patches of cultivation. Soon we climbed above the clouds, which presented a most curious appearance as we looked down upon them. The strata through which we had passed was so dense and so white that it looked exactly like an enormous glacier, covered with fresh fallen snow, extending for miles and miles, while the projecting tops of the other Canary Islands appeared only like great solitary rocks. The sun had already become very oppressive, and at 7:30 we stopped to breakfast and to water the horses. 8:30 found us in the saddle again, and we commenced to traverse a dreary plain of yellowish white pumice stone, interspersed with huge blocks of obsidian thrown from the mouth of the volcano. At first the monotony of the scene was relieved by large bushes of yellow broom in full flower, and still larger bushes of the beautiful Retama blanca, quite covered with lovely white bloom, scenting the air with its delicious fragrance, and resembling huge tufts of feathers 8 or 9 feet high. As we proceeded, however, we left all traces of vegetation behind us. It was like the Great Sahara. On every side a vast expanse of yellow pumice stone sand spread around us, an occasional block of rock sticking up here and there, and looking as if it had indeed been fused in a mighty furnace. By 10:30 we had reached the Estancia de los Ingleses, 9,639 feet above the level of the sea, where the baggage and some of the horses had to be left behind, the saddles being transferred to mules for the very steep climb before us. After a drink of water all round, we started again, and commenced the ascent of the almost perpendicular stream of lava and stone which forms the only practicable route to the top. Our poor beasts were only able to go a few paces at a time without stopping to regain their breath. The loose ashes and lava fortunately gave them a good foothold, or it would have been quite impossible for them to get along at all. One was only encouraged to proceed by the sight of one's friends above, looking like flies clinging to the face of a wall. The road, if such it can be called, ran in zigzags, each of which was about the length of 2 horses, so that we were in turns one above another. There were a few slips and slides and tumbles, but no important casualties, and in about an hour and a half we had reached the Alta Vista, a tiny plateau, where the horses were to be left. The expedition so far had been such a fatiguing one, and the heat was so great, that the children and I decided to remain here, and to let the gentlemen proceed alone to the summit of the peak. We tried to find some shade, but the sun was so immediately above us that this was almost an impossibility. However, we managed to squeeze ourselves under some slightly overhanging rocks, and I took some photographs while the children slept. The guide soon returned with water barrels full of ice, procured from a cabin above, where there is a stream of water constantly running, and nothing could have been more grateful and refreshing. It was more than 3 hours before Tom and Captain Lecky reappeared, to be soon followed by the rest of the party. Whilst they rested and refreshed themselves with ice, they described the ascent as fatiguing in the extreme, in fact almost an impossibility for a lady. First they had scrambled over huge blocks of rough lava to the tiny plain of the Rambleta, 11,466 feet above the level of the sea, after which they had to climb up the cone itself, 530 feet in height, and sloping at an angle of 44 degrees. It is composed of ashes and calcined chalk, into which their feet sank, while for every 2 steps they made forwards and upwards, they slipped 1 backwards. But those who reached the top were rewarded for their exertions by a glorious view, and by the wonderful appearance of the summit of the peak. The ground beneath their feet was hot, while sulphurous vapours and smoke issued from various small fissures around them, though there has been no actual eruption from this crater of the volcano since 1704. They brought down with them a beautiful piece of calcined chalk, covered with crystals of sulphur and arsenic, and some other specimens. Parched and dry as the ground looked where I was resting, a few grains of barley, dropped by mules on the occasion of a previous visit, had taken root and had grown up into ear, and there were also a few roots of a sort of dog violet, showing its delicate lavender-coloured flowers 11,000 feet above the sea, and far beyond the level of any other vegetation. It was impossible to ride down to the spot where we had left the baggage animals, and the descent was consequently very fatiguing and even painful. At every step our feet sank into a mass of loose scoriae and ashes, and so we went slipping, sliding, and stumbling along, sometimes running against a rock, and sometimes nearly pitching forward on our faces. All this, too, beneath a blazing sun, with the thermometer at 78 degrees, and not a vestige of shade. At last Tom and I reached the bottom, where, after partaking of luncheon and draughts of quinine, we lay down under the shadow of a great rock to recruit our weary frames. Refreshed by our meal, we started at 6 o'clock on our return journey, and went down a good deal faster than we came up. Before the end of the Pumice Stone or Retama Plains had been reached, it was nearly dark. Sundry small accidents occurring to stirrup leathers, bridles, and girths, for the saddlery was not of the best description, delayed us slightly, and as Tom, Dr. Potter, Allnutt, and the guide had got on ahead, we soon lost sight of them. After an interval of uncertainty, the other guides confessed that they did not know the way back in the dark. This was not pleasant, for the roads were terrible, and during the whole of our journey up, from the port to the peak, We had met only 4 people in all, 2 goatherds with their flocks, and 2 neveros, bringing down ice to the town. There was, therefore, not much chance of gaining information from any one on our way down. We wandered about among low bushes, down watercourses, and over rocks for a long time. Horns were blown, and other means of attracting attention were tried, first one and then another of the party meanwhile coming more or less to grief. My good little horse fell down 3 times, though we did not part company, and once he went up a steep bank by mistake, instead of going down a very nasty watercourse, which I do not wonder at his objecting to. I managed to jump off in time, and so no harm was done, but it was rather anxious work. About 10 o'clock we saw a light in the distance, and with much shouting woke up the inhabitants of the cottage whence it proceeded, promising to reward them liberally if they would only show us our way back. 3 of them consented to do this, and provided themselves accordingly with pine torches, wrapped round with bracken and leaves. One, a very fine man, dressed in white, with his arm extended above his head, bearing the light, led the way. Another walked in front of my horse, while the third brought up the rear. They conducted us down the most frightfully steep paths until we had descended beneath the clouds, when the light from our torches threw our shadows in gigantic form upon the mists above, reminding us of the legend of the spectre of the Brocken. At last the torches began to go out, one by one, and just as the last light was expiring we arrived at a small village, where we of course found that everybody was asleep. After some delay, during which Mabel and I were so tired that we lay down in the street to rest, more torches were procured, and a fresh guide, who led us into the comparatively good path towards Puerto Orotava. Finally, half an hour after midnight, we arrived at the house of the Vice Consul, who had provided refreshments for us, and whose nephew was still very kindly sitting up awaiting our return. But we were too tired to do anything but go straight on board the yacht, where, after some supper and champagne, we were indeed glad to retire to our berths. This was at 3:30 a.m., exactly 29 hours since we had been called on Friday night. It is certainly too long an expedition to be performed in one day. Tents should be taken and arrangements made for camping out for 1, if not 2 nights. But in the case of such a large party as ours this would have been a great business, as everything must be carried to so great a height, up such steep places, and over such bad roads. Still, there are so many objects and places of interest, not only on but around the peak, that it is a pity to see them only when hurried and fatigued. Sunday, July 23rd. Orders had been given not to call us nor to wash decks, and it was consequently 10:30 before any one awoke, and midday before the first of our party put in an appearance on deck. Long before this the Sunbeam had been inundated with visitors from the shore. We had given a general invitation to the friends of the Vice Consul to come and see the yacht, and they accordingly arrived in due course, accompanied in many cases by a large circle of acquaintances. Those who came first were conducted below and all over the vessel, but the number ultimately became so great that, in self-defence, we were obliged to limit their wanderings to the deck, opening the skylights wide, however, to enable them to see as much as possible of the saloon and cabins. From breakfast time until prayers, at 3 o'clock, when the yacht was closed for an hour, there was a constant stream of visitors from the shore. It was a great nuisance, but still it seemed unkind to refuse to allow them to see what they had never seen before, and might possibly never have an opportunity of seeing again. All steamers and sailing ships, as a rule, go to Santa Cruz, and the fame of our vessel having been spread abroad by our visitors of Friday, many of the poor people had come from villages far away over the mountains. We could not help feeling a certain respect for the determined way in which physical infirmity was mastered by curiosity. Though many experienced very serious inconvenience from the motion of the vessel, they still persevered in their examination. About 5 o'clock we went ashore ourselves, and drove up to Villa Orotava. The wide road is macadamized, and marked with kilometre stones, and is planted on either side with pepper trees, plane trees, and the Eucalyptus globulus, which has grown 35 metres, or 115 feet, in 7 years. The hedges are formed of blue plumbago, scarlet geranium, yellow acacia, lavender-coloured heliotrope, white jasmine, and pink and white roses. After driving a few miles we turned down an old paved road towards the sea, and by dint of a considerable amount of shaking arrived at the celebrated botanical gardens mentioned by Humboldt and others. We passed through a small house, with a fine dragon tree on either side, and entered the gardens, where we found a valuable collection of trees and shrubs of almost every known species. The kind and courteous curator, Don Herman Wildgaret, accompanied us, and explained the peculiarities of the many interesting plants from Europe, Asia, Africa, America, Australia, New Zealand, and the various islands of the North and South Pacific and Indian Oceans. The climate of Tenerife is so equable that the island forms a true garden of acclimatization for the vegetable productions of the various countries of the world. By the judicious expenditure of a little more money, this establishment might be made an important means of introducing to Europe many new and valuable plants. At present the annual income is 5,000 francs, the salary of the curator being 1,000 francs. A rough drive over paved roads, commanding extensive views of sea and rocks, and of some palm trees on a promontory in the distance, brought us, at about 7 o'clock, to the boat, which was waiting our return. We arrived in due course on board the Sunbeam, laden with bouquets of the choicest flowers, and soon after dinner we all retired to bed, not having yet recovered from the fatigues of yesterday. Monday, July 24th. What one gains in the beauty and abundance of vegetable life here, one loses in its rapid and premature decay. Fruit gathered in the morning is scarcely fit to eat at night, and the flowers brought on board yesterday evening were dead to-day at 4:30 a.m., whilst some of the roses we brought from Cowes lasted until we reached Madeira, though it must be owned so many fell to pieces that my cabin used to be daily swept with rose leaves instead of tea leaves. We went ashore soon after 6, and drove straight to the garden of the Marquis de Sonzal, where there is a beautiful palm tree, 101 feet high, the remains of an enormous dragon tree, old even in the 15th century, besides hedges of myrtle, jasmine, and clematis, and flowers of every description in full bloom. The dragon tree is a species of Dracaena, and looks rather like a gigantic candelabra, composed of a number of yuccas, perched on the top of a gnarled and somewhat deformed stem, half palm, half cactus. Another beautiful garden was next visited, belonging to the Marquis de la Candia, who received us and showed us his coffee and plantains in full growth, as well as a magnificent Spanish chestnut tree, coeval with the dragon tree. Out of one of its almost decayed branches a so-called young tree was growing, but it would have been thought very respectable and middle-aged in any other locality. Everyone here, as in Madeira, has been more or less ruined by the failure of the vines. Most of the large landed proprietors have left their estates to take care of themselves, and the peasants for the last few years have been emigrating by hundreds to Caracas in Venezuela. Things are, however, beginning to look up a little now. The cultivation of cochineal appears to succeed, though the price is low, coffee answers well, and permission has been obtained from the Spanish government to grow tobacco, accompanied by a promise to purchase, at a certain fixed rate, all that can be produced. Still, people talk of the island of Tenerife as something very different now from what it was 25 or 30 years ago, both as regards the number of its inhabitants and the activity of its commerce, and moreover the good old times, a custom I have remarked in many other places. The Marquis de la Candia and Don Herman Wildgaret returned on board with us to breakfast. The anchor had been weighed, and the Sunbeam was slowly steaming up and down, waiting for us. The stream of visitors had been as great and as constant as ever during our absence, in spite of the heavy roll of the sea, and the deck seemed quite covered with baskets of flowers and fruit, kindly sent on board by the people who had been over the yacht the day before. Amongst the latest arrivals were some very handsome Spanish ladies, beautifully dressed in black, with mantillas, each of whom was accompanied by a young man carrying a basin. It must, I fear, be confessed that this was rather a trial to the gravity of all on board. It certainly was an instance of the pursuit of knowledge, or the gratification of curiosity, under considerable difficulties. Immediately after breakfast our friends bade us adieu, and went ashore in the shore boat, while we steamed along the north side of the island, past the splendid cliffs of Buena Vista, rising 2,000 feet sheer from the sea, to Cape Teno, the extreme western point of Tenerife. In the distance we could see the Great Canary, Palma, and Hierro, and soon passed close to the rocky island of Gomera. Here, too, the dark cliffs, of volcanic form and origin, are magnificent, and as we were almost becalmed by the high land, whilst we sailed along the north shore of the island, we had ample opportunities of admiring its rugged beauty. During the night we approached Palma, another large island of the Canary group, containing one of the most remarkable calderas, or large basins, formed by volcanic action in the world. CHAPTER III